The hunting dog's howls echoed across the Georgia plantation as Peter Williams crept through the moonlit kennels, his body slick with hog's blood, whispering commands he had secretly taught them over months of patient planning. What happened next would make Elias Ford, the most feared overseer in 3 counties, realize that even the most broken man could turn predator into prey. The morning would bring screams, chaos, and a trail leading north that no hound would ever dare follow again. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn of 1850 brought an unusual chill to the Whitmore plantation in southern Georgia, where cotton fields stretched beyond the horizon like a white sea under the relentless sun. Among the hundreds of enslaved souls who toiled there, Peter Williams stood apart, not for his size, though he was tall and broad-shouldered, but for the quiet intelligence that flickered behind his dark eyes. At 28 years old, he had spent his entire life on this land, watching seasons change while his circumstances remained brutally constant. Peter possessed a rare gift that few recognized, a natural ability to communicate with animals that had manifested since childhood. As a boy, he had calmed wild horses with nothing but his voice and gentle touch, tamed feral cats that wandered onto the plantation, and even convinced rattlesnakes to slither away rather than strike. His fellow slaves whispered that he carried some ancient magic in his blood, a connection to the natural world that slavery couldn't break. But Peter understood it differently. He simply listened to what animals were telling him and spoke back in ways they could understand. The overseer, Elias Ford, had arrived at Whitmore Plantation 3 years earlier with a reputation that preceded him like smoke from a house fire. Ford was a lean, weathered man with pale eyes that seemed to look right through a person, calculating their worth and finding them wanting. He had worked plantations from South Carolina to Louisiana, leaving behind a trail of broken spirits and unmarked graves. Master Whitmore had hired him specifically for his efficiency in maintaining discipline, and Ford had exceeded expectations in the most horrifying ways. Ford's most feared weapon wasn't the whip that hung from his belt, or the pistol tucked into his waistband. It was his pack of hunting dogs. 6 massive bloodhounds that he had trained not just to track runaway slaves, but to terrorize them into submission. These weren't ordinary tracking dogs. Ford had conditioned them to associate the scent of fear with permission to attack. The mere sound of their baying in the distance was enough to make grown men weep and turn themselves in, rather than face what awaited them in the woods. Peter had witnessed the dogs work firsthand on a humid July morning when 17-year-old Moses had attempted to reach his sister on a neighboring plantation. The boy had made it less than 5 miles before Ford's hounds caught his trail. When they dragged him back, Moses was barely recognizable, his clothes torn to shreds, deep puncture wounds covering his arms and legs where the dogs had latched on and held him until Ford arrived. The boy's eyes held a vacant stare that never quite returned to normal, and he walked with a permanent limp that served as a daily reminder to everyone of what happened to those who ran. The incident with Moses had planted a seed in Peter's mind that grew slowly but persistently over the following months. He began observing Ford's dogs with new intensity, studying their behavior, their hierarchy, their routines. He noticed that despite their fearsome reputation, they were still animals with the same basic needs and instincts as any other creature. They responded to kindness, they craved affection, and most importantly, they could be taught. Ford kept the dogs in a large pen behind his quarters, a sturdy wooden enclosure surrounded by iron fencing that kept the hounds secure but visible. The overseer took pride in their appearance, keeping them well-fed and groomed, so they would look as intimidating as they were effective. Every morning at dawn, Ford would emerge from his cabin and walk the perimeter of the pen, inspecting his prized hunters while they pressed against the fence, eager for attention and the promise of work. Peter's opportunity came through his assigned duties in the plantation smokehouse, which sat approximately 50 yards from Ford's quarters. His job was to tend the fires that preserved the meat, a position that required him to work odd hours and move about the grounds when others were sleeping or occupied elsewhere. It was during these quiet moments that Peter began his careful campaign to win over Ford's hunting pack. The first step required weeks of patient observation. Peter learned each dog's individual personality, identifying the alpha male, a scarred beast named Rex who bore the marks of countless hunts, and the more submissive females who followed his lead. He discovered that despite their training to attack fleeing slaves, they were hungry for positive interaction and affection that Ford rarely provided beyond basic maintenance. The overseer treated them as tools, rather than living creatures, which created an opening that Peter recognized he could exploit. On a moonless night in early September, Peter made his first direct contact with the dogs. Armed with scraps of fresh pork from the smokehouse, he approached the pen slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones that he had perfected over years of working with animals. The dogs initially growled and showed their teeth, but Peter's calm persistence and the offering of food gradually won them over. By the end of that first encounter, 2 of the younger females were allowing him to scratch behind their ears through the fence. Night after night, Peter continued his secret visits to the pen, each time building greater trust with Ford's hounds. He learned their names by listening to the overseer's commands during training sessions, memorizing which dogs responded to which vocal cues and hand signals. Rex proved the most challenging to win over. The alpha's loyalty to Ford ran deeper than simple conditioning, but even he eventually succumbed to Peter's patient approach and genuine affection. The breakthrough came when Peter realized that Ford's training methods relied heavily on fear and dominance, creating dogs that were eager to please, but lacking in true emotional connection to their handler. Peter offered something different, genuine care and understanding, that spoke to their basic canine nature. Within weeks, the dogs were greeting his nighttime visits with wagging tails and quiet whines of excitement that had to be carefully managed to avoid attracting Ford's attention. As autumn deepened and the cotton harvest reached its peak, Peter began the second phase of his plan. Having established trust with the dogs, he started introducing new commands and associations that would serve his ultimate purpose. Using techniques he had observed from watching Ford's training sessions, but applying them with kindness rather than brutality, Peter taught the dogs to respond to his voice with the same obedience they showed their official handler. The process required incredible patience and precision. Peter had to ensure that his training didn't interfere with the dog's performance for Ford during the day, while simultaneously building new neural pathways that would serve his purposes when the time came. He accomplished this by using slightly different vocal tones and hand signals that were similar enough to Ford's commands to feel familiar, but distinct enough that the dogs learned to associate them specifically with Peter. During this time, Peter also began preparing for the physical aspects of his plan. He studied Ford's routines obsessively, noting when the overseer was most vulnerable, where he spent his time, and how the dog's presence might be used against him. Peter realized that Ford's confidence in his own security measures had made him careless. The overseer never imagined that someone might turn his own weapons against him. The catalyst for action came on a cold November morning when Ford decided to make an example of Sarah, a young woman who had been caught trying to send a letter to her children on another plantation. Ford announced that he would use this incident to demonstrate the consequences of unauthorized communication, and he ordered the dogs to be prepared for a public display of discipline that would serve as a warning to Besh. Everyone on the plantation. Peter watched in horror as Ford had Sarah tied to a post in the main yard, while the assembled slaves were forced to witness what followed. The overseer released 2 of his smaller dogs and commanded them to circle the terrified woman, snapping at her legs and arms while she screamed for mercy. The dogs didn't seriously injure her. Ford was too clever to permanently damage valuable property, but the psychological impact was devastating. Sarah's terror was palpable, and Peter could see the effect it had on everyone present. That night, as Sarah lay in the slave quarters sobbing from trauma and shame, Peter made his final decision. He had been planning and preparing for months, but seeing Ford's casual cruelty toward an innocent woman crystallized his resolve. The overseer had to be stopped, and Peter finally had the means to do it. The plan required careful timing and perfect execution. Peter waited for the new moon, when darkness would provide maximum cover for his movements. He also needed Ford to be in his quarters alone, without the unpredictable presence of visitors or other plantation personnel who might complicate the situation. Fortune smiled on Peter's preparation when Master Whitmore announced he would be traveling to Savannah for business, leaving Ford in complete control of the plantation for several days. On the chosen night, Peter began his preparations, while the plantation slept. He had been collecting pig's blood from the smokehouse for weeks, storing it in small containers hidden beneath the floorboards of his own cabin. The blood served multiple purposes in his plan. It would mask his human scent, create the right olfactory associations for the dogs, and provide the visceral element that would trigger their hunting instincts when properly directed. Peter coated himself thoroughly with the pig's blood, paying special attention to his hands and clothing where the scent would be strongest. The sensation was revolting, but he forced himself to focus on the greater purpose his actions would serve. This wasn't just about revenge against Ford, though that desire certainly burned within him. It was about protecting everyone on the plantation from the overseer's reign of terror. Moving silently through the darkness, Peter approached Ford's quarters from the side where shadows were deepest and the likelihood of detection was minimal. The dogs detected his presence long before he reached their pen, but instead of raising an alarm, they pressed against the fence with tails wagging, recognizing their secret friend despite the strange smell that now covered him. Peter spent several precious minutes calming the dogs and reinforcing their positive association with his presence. He whispered the commands he had taught them over months of careful training, ensuring they understood that what was about to happen was sanctioned by someone they trusted and respected. The dogs' training had prepared them to follow strong leadership, and Peter had positioned himself as an alternative alpha whose authority they had learned to acknowledge. The next phase required Peter to release the dogs from their pen, a task that involved manipulating the heavy iron latch that Ford used to secure the enclosure. Peter had practiced this maneuver during his nighttime visits, using scraps of metal to understand how the mechanism worked and how much force would be required to open it quietly. The latch clicked open with only the slightest sound, and the dogs remained calm as Peter swung the gate wide. Rather than rushing out in excitement, the dogs looked to Peter for guidance, their months of secret training having taught them to await his commands before acting. Peter felt a moment of profound responsibility as he realized how completely these animals now trusted him. What he was about to ask them to do would fundamentally change their nature, transforming them from tools of oppression into instruments of justice. Peter led the pack toward Ford's cabin, his heart pounding as they crossed the open ground between the pen and the overseer's quarters. The dogs moved silently, their natural hunting instincts enhanced by their understanding that this was serious business requiring stealth and focus. Peter could feel their anticipation building as they approached their target, months of conditioning finally coming to fruition. Ford's cabin sat elevated on wooden posts, with a small porch and steps leading to the front door. Peter knew from careful observation that the overseer typically left his windows open during warm nights, relying on the presence of his dogs to deter any potential threats. Tonight, that assumed security would become Ford's downfall. Peter positioned himself beneath one of the open windows and began the final phase of his plan. Using hand signals and whispered commands that the dogs had learned to obey without question, he directed their attention toward the cabin and the man sleeping inside. The scent of pig's blood that covered Peter created powerful olfactory associations that linked him to the hunt while simultaneously triggering the dog's predatory instincts. The genius of Peter's approach lay in how he had restructured the dog's understanding of their role. Instead of seeing Ford as their master and protector, months of secret conditioning had taught them to view Peter as their true alpha, and Ford as simply another target to be hunted. The pig's blood scent reinforced this new hierarchy, while providing the sensory trigger that would unleash their trained aggression. Peter gave the final command, a low whistle that he had taught the dogs to associate with permission to attack. The effect was immediate and terrifying. 6 hunting dogs that had been bred and trained for violence suddenly focused that energy on their former master with single-minded intensity. They launched themselves through Ford's open windows and door with the same savage efficiency they had previously reserved for runaway slaves. Ford's screams pierced the night air as he awoke to find himself under attack by his own animals. The overseer, who had inspired fear in hundreds of enslaved people through his control of these very dogs, now experienced that terror firsthand as the pack descended upon him with unprecedented fury. The irony was not lost on Peter, who watched from outside as justice finally visited the man who had dispensed so much cruelty. The attack was swift and decisive. Ford's training had made the dogs efficient killers, and they applied those skills with lethal effectiveness against their former handler. Peter felt no satisfaction in Ford's suffering, only a grim sense that balance had been restored to a world that had been twisted by the overseer's cruelty. The sounds from inside the cabin gradually subsided as Ford's struggles ended. Peter knew he had only minutes before the commotion attracted attention from other parts of the plantation. Working quickly, he called the dogs away from Ford's body and led them back toward their pen. The pack obeyed his commands without hesitation, their loyalty now completely transferred from their former master to the man who had shown them genuine affection and respect. Instead of returning the dogs to their enclosure, Peter made a decision that surprised even himself. He released them into the darkness beyond the plantation boundaries, giving them the freedom they had never known under Ford's harsh control. The dogs understood this gift instinctively, and after a final moment of connection with the man who had liberated them, they disappeared into the Georgia wilderness, where they would live as nature intended. Peter then began covering his tracks, both literally and figuratively. He used Ford's own tools to create a trail leading north from the cabin, suggesting that the overseer had been attacked by unknown assailants who then fled toward the Free States. Peter scattered personal items along this false trail, including pieces of Ford's clothing torn to suggest a struggle, and even some of the overseer's blood to reinforce the deception. The most crucial element of Peter's misdirection involved eliminating evidence of his own involvement. He buried the containers that had held the pig's blood, burned the clothes he had worn during the attack, and carefully cleaned any traces of blood from his body using water from a nearby stream. By dawn, no physical evidence connected him to Ford's death beyond his presence on the plantation, which was easily explained by his legitimate duties. When Master Whitmore returned from Savannah 2 days later, he found his plantation in chaos. Ford's body had been discovered by other overseers who had come looking for him when he failed to appear for his morning rounds. The false trail leading north had convinced local authorities that Ford had been killed by abolitionists or escaped slaves who had returned seeking revenge. The investigation that followed was thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Sheriff's deputies interviewed every slave on the plantation, including Peter, but found no evidence pointing toward any specific individual or group. Peter's reputation as a quiet, obedient worker served him well during questioning, and his genuine grief over the loss of life, even Ford's life, convinced investigators of his innocence. The absence of Ford's dogs puzzled authorities, who initially assumed the animals had been stolen by the same parties responsible for the overseer's death. Search parties combed the surrounding countryside, but found no trace of the valuable hunting pack. Local newspapers reported the mysterious disappearance as evidence of a well-organized conspiracy against plantation security, further reinforcing the narrative that outside agitators were responsible. Master Whitmore hired a new overseer within the week, a man named Roberts who lacked Ford's reputation for extreme violence, but maintained strict discipline through more conventional means. The change in atmosphere on the plantation was immediate and profound. Without the constant threat of Ford's dogs, slaves found small freedoms that had been impossible under the previous regime. Peter continued his duties in the smokehouse, maintaining the same quiet demeanor that had served him so well throughout his secret campaign against Ford. He never spoke of what had happened that night, not even to his closest friends among the slave community, understanding that some secrets were too dangerous to share. The knowledge of what he had accomplished remained locked within his own heart. A private victory in a war that few even recognized was being fought. Months passed, and the memory of Ford's reign of terror began to fade as life on the plantation settled into new routines. Peter noticed changes in his fellow slaves that went beyond the simple absence of physical intimidation. People stood a little straighter, spoke with slightly less fear, and dared to hope for small improvements in their daily existence. The psychological impact of Ford's removal had created ripple effects that touched every aspect of plantation life. The true measure of Peter's success became apparent when Roberts attempted to acquire new hunting dogs to replace Ford's missing pack. Despite offering substantial sums to dog traders throughout Georgia and South Carolina, Roberts found that no animal would work effectively in the role Ford's hounds had filled. Word had somehow spread through the complex networks that connected plantations across the South, and dogs that had been bred and trained for slave catching refused to perform when brought to Whitmore Plantation. Local animal handlers attributed this phenomenon to supernatural causes, claiming that the ghost of Ford's pack haunted the grounds and prevented other dogs from taking their place. Peter understood the real explanation was far more practical but equally effective. His liberation of Ford's dogs had sent a message through the animal kingdom that was beyond human comprehension, but clearly understood by creatures who lived closer to natural law than their human masters. As winter gave way to spring, Peter began considering the next phase of his life. Ford's death had eliminated the immediate threat that had motivated his elaborate plan, but it had also awakened something within him that could not easily be put back to sleep. Peter had discovered that even within the constraints of slavery, individual action could create meaningful change. The question now was how to build upon that knowledge without exposing himself to unnecessary risk. The answer came from an unexpected source, when a group of escaped slaves passing through the area sought shelter in the abandoned buildings at the edge of Whitmore Plantation. Peter encountered them during one of his nighttime trips to tend the smokehouse fires, and their leader, a woman named Freedom, who had taken that name after her escape from a Louisiana sugar plantation, recognized something in Peter's demeanor that marked him as different from other slaves they had encountered. Freedom's group was part of the Underground Railroad network that helped escaped slaves reach safety in the North, and they were always seeking local contacts who could provide information, supplies, or temporary shelter. Peter's position on the plantation, combined with his demonstrated ability to take decisive action without detection, made him an ideal candidate for recruitment into their secret organization. The decision to join the Underground Railroad represented a significant escalation in Peter's resistance activities, but it felt like a natural progression from his successful campaign against Ford. Having proven to himself that carefully planned action could achieve seemingly impossible goals, Peter was ready to apply those same skills to helping others escape the bonds of slavery entirely. Over the following months, Peter became a crucial link in the Underground Railroad chain that ran through central Georgia. His work in the smokehouse provided legitimate reasons to be active during unusual hours, and his reputation for reliability made it easy to explain away any minor inconsistencies in his routine. Most importantly, his experience with Ford had taught him how to think strategically about security and misdirection. Peter's first Underground Railroad operation involved helping a family of 4 escape from a neighboring plantation where conditions had become unbearable under a new overseer who made even Ford seem merciful. By comparison, Peter provided them with food, supplies, and detailed information about safe routes north, drawing on his extensive knowledge of local geography and seasonal patterns that affected travel conditions. The success of that first mission led to others, each one carefully planned and executed with the same attention to detail that had characterized Peter's campaign against Ford. Word of his reliability spread through the Underground Railroad network, and soon conductors from as far away as South Carolina were routing escapees through Georgia specifically to take advantage of Peter's assistance. Peter's activities inevitably attracted the attention of slave catchers and local authorities, but his careful operational security kept him one step ahead of detection. He never met escaped slaves directly, instead using a system of dead drops and coded messages that maintained separation between different elements of the operation. If any single link in the chain was compromised, the damage would be contained without exposing Peter or other key operators. The psychological impact of Peter's Underground Railroad work extended far beyond the individual slaves he helped escape. Knowledge that successful resistance was possible spread through the slave communities across central Georgia, inspiring others to take their own steps toward freedom. Some followed Peter's example by escaping north, while others found ways to resist oppression within the constraints of their existing circumstances. Master Whitmore began noticing increased restlessness among his slaves during the summer of 1851, nearly a year after Ford's death. Productivity remained acceptable, but there was a subtle shift in attitudes that suggested people were no longer resigned to permanent bondage. Whitmore attributed this change to the absence of Ford's intimidating presence, and made plans to hire additional security personnel to restore proper discipline. Peter understood that his window of opportunity was closing as plantation owners throughout the region began implementing new security measures designed to prevent both escapes and internal resistance. The success of the Underground Railroad operations had inadvertently made life more difficult for slaves who remained behind, as masters cracked down on everyone in response to the activities of a few. The decision to make his own escape came when Peter learned that Whitmore was planning to sell several slaves to cover debts incurred by failed cotton speculation. Peter's name appeared on the preliminary list of people to be sold, along with several others who had worked closely with him over the years. The prospect of being separated from the community where he had built his resistance network, combined with the uncertainty of conditions under a new master, convinced Peter that the time had come to seek freedom for Gren himself. Planning his own escape required different considerations than the operations Peter had organized for others. As someone known to plantation authorities and local law enforcement, he would face greater scrutiny than anonymous runaways from distant locations. Peter also needed to ensure that his departure wouldn't compromise the Underground Railroad network he had helped establish, which meant severing all connections and eliminating evidence of his activities. Peter spent weeks preparing for his escape, using techniques he had learned from helping others, while adapting them to his specific situation. He accumulated supplies gradually, hiding food, clothing, and tools in various locations along his planned route north. Most importantly, he created multiple false trails and misdirection strategies designed to confuse pursuers and buy precious time during the critical early stages of his flight. The night Peter chose for his escape coincided with a violent thunderstorm that would mask sounds of his departure, while making tracking more difficult for any pursuit that might be organized. Peter had studied weather patterns for months, waiting for conditions that would provide natural cover for his activities. The storm that finally arrived exceeded his expectations, bringing torrential rain and high winds that would challenge even the most determined slave catchers. Peter's escape route took him through terrain he had scouted during his Underground Railroad operations, following paths that avoided main roads and populated areas where he might be recognized. He moved quickly through the darkness, his intimate knowledge of local geography allowing him to navigate confidently, despite the challenging weather conditions. Every mile he covered increased his chances of reaching safety before his absence was discovered. Dawn broke gray and stormy, with rain continuing to fall as Peter reached the first safe house on his planned route. The operator there, a free black farmer named Joshua who had been working with the Underground Railroad for years, provided Peter with dry clothes, hot food, and updated information about conditions further north. Peter's reputation had preceded him, and Joshua treated him with the respect accorded to a proven ally, rather than just another escapee. The journey north took Peter through a network of safe houses and sympathetic contacts that he had helped establish during his Underground Railroad activities. At each stop, he found people who knew his work by reputation and were eager to assist someone who had risked so much to help others. The irony of benefiting from a system he had helped create was not lost on Peter, but he accepted the assistance gratefully while remaining vigilant for signs of pursuit. News of Peter's escape reached Whitmore Plantation within hours of the storm's passage, when the overseer Roberts discovered his absence during the morning roll call. A search of Peter's quarters revealed that he had removed all personal possessions, confirming that this was a planned escape rather than a temporary absence. Roberts immediately organized search parties and contacted local authorities, but the storm had eliminated most traces of Peter's passage. The manhunt that followed was extensive but ultimately unsuccessful. Slave catchers brought in from neighboring counties found evidence of Peter's initial route, but the trail went cold after the first few miles where he had employed misdirection techniques learned from his Underground Railroad experience. Professional trackers acknowledged that they were dealing with someone who understood their methods and had planned accordingly. Peter's escape became a source of inspiration for slaves throughout central Georgia, proving that even long-term plantation residents could successfully seek freedom if they possessed the knowledge and determination necessary for such an undertaking. The psychological impact of his flight was magnified by his reputation as the quiet, reliable worker who had never shown obvious signs of rebelliousness before disappearing into the night. The Underground Railroad network that Peter had helped establish continued operating after his departure, though with increased caution due to heightened security measures implemented by local plantation owners. The operators Peter had recruited and trained carried on his work, helping dozens of additional slaves reach freedom over the following months and years. Peter's influence on the resistance movement extended far beyond his direct actions, creating a legacy that would outlast the institution of slavery itself. Peter's journey to freedom took him through Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, following established underground railroad routes that carried him steadily away from the dangers of recapture. At each stage of the journey, he found people who had heard of his work in Georgia and were honored to assist someone who had contributed so much to the cause of liberation. The network of abolitionists and sympathizers that he encountered reinforced his faith in the possibility of meaningful change. The final stage of Peter's journey brought him to Canada, where he joined a community of escaped slaves who had found genuine freedom beyond the reach of American slave catchers. Peter settled in a small town outside Toronto, where he found work as a blacksmith and began rebuilding his life as a free man. The skills he had developed during his years of resistance served him well in his new circumstances, as he quickly established himself as a reliable and trustworthy member of the community. Peter never forgot the people he had left behind in Georgia, and he remained active in abolitionist circles throughout his life in Canada. He provided information and assistance to underground railroad operations, helped newly arrived escapees adjust to freedom, and spoke publicly about his experiences whenever such testimony might advance the cause of ending slavery. His story became a powerful example of how individual courage and careful planning could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The dogs that Peter had liberated from Ford's kennel were occasionally sighted in the Georgia wilderness over the years that followed, living as a wild pack that avoided human contact while thriving in their natural environment. Local hunters reported encounters with unusually large and intelligent animals that seemed to understand human behavior well enough to avoid traps and other dangers. These sightings became part of local folklore, with many people attributing supernatural qualities to the creatures that had once terrorized escaped slaves. Master Widmore never replaced Ford's hunting dogs, partly due to the practical difficulties encountered by Overseer Roberts, but also because the entire system of using animals to track and intimidate slaves had been fundamentally compromised by Peter's actions. The psychological advantage that such dogs had provided was lost once people realized that the animals could be turned against their handlers, and alternative security measures proved both more expensive and less effective. The plantation system that had defined life in central Georgia for generations began changing in subtle ways following Peter's escape and the broader underground railroad activities he had inspired. While slavery remained legal and enforced, the absolute control that masters had once exercised over their human property was gradually eroded by the knowledge that resistance was possible and that escape routes existed for those brave enough to use them. Peter's story spread through both slave communities and abolitionist networks, becoming a powerful example of how intelligence, patience, and careful planning could achieve goals that seemed impossible through direct confrontation. His success in turning Ford's own weapons against him demonstrated that oppressive systems contained the seeds of their own destruction if individuals were clever enough to exploit those weaknesses. The legacy of Peter's resistance extended far beyond the immediate impact of Ford's death or his own successful escape. The techniques he had developed for building trust with animals, organizing clandestine operations, and maintaining operational security became part of the collective knowledge that underground railroad operators shared with each other. His innovations in misdirection and counter-surveillance helped countless other escapees reach freedom over the years that followed. As Peter aged in his Canadian home, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known slavery, he often reflected on the night when he had coated himself in pig's blood and crept into Ford's kennel with revenge and justice burning in his heart. That moment had changed not only his own destiny, but the lives of everyone who had benefited from the Underground Railroad network he had helped establish. The quiet slave who had possessed an unusual gift for communicating with animals had discovered that his greatest talent lay in understanding human nature and finding ways to turn oppression against itself. The hunting dogs never returned to their former work, and the blood-soaked night when they had torn their master apart became a turning point in the long struggle for freedom that would eventually consume the nation in civil war. Peter Williams had struck the first blow in that conflict, proving that even the most powerless individual could find ways to fight back against injustice when they possessed the courage to act and the intelligence to plan carefully. In the end, Peter's triumph lay not just in his personal escape from slavery or his successful revenge against Ford, but in his demonstration that resistance was possible even under the most oppressive circumstances. His story became a beacon of hope for everyone who faced seemingly impossible odds, proving that determination, careful planning, and a willingness to take calculated risks could overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression. The overseer's dogs had been turned against him under the midnight moon, and the reverberations from that act of defiance would continue spreading long after the last hound had disappeared into the Georgia wilderness, carrying with them the scent of freedom that no amount of training could ever completely eliminate. Years passed in Peter's Canadian sanctuary, but the memories of that blood-soaked night remained vivid in his mind, not as nightmares, but as reminders of what ordinary people could accomplish when pushed beyond endurance. Peter established himself as more than just another escaped slave in his new community. He became a strategist and organizer whose experiences in Georgia had taught him lessons that proved invaluable in the broader fight against slavery. The town of Chatham, where Peter eventually settled, had become a haven for escaped slaves and free blacks who had fled American persecution. The community was diverse, including farmers, craftsmen, teachers, and former slaves who had purchased their freedom through years of careful saving. Peter found himself naturally gravitating toward leadership roles, his quiet intelligence and proven track record making him someone others instinctively trusted with important decisions. Peter's blacksmith shop became an unofficial headquarters for Underground Railroad activities in the region, though he maintained the same operational security that had served him so well in Georgia. The shop's legitimate business provided cover for meetings and planning sessions, while the steady stream of customers created opportunities to pass information and coordinate assistance for newly arrived escapees. Peter had learned that the most effective resistance operations appeared completely ordinary to outside observers. Among the refugees who found their way to Peter's shop was Marcus, a young man who had escaped from a Virginia plantation after witnessing his sister's sale to a trader heading to the Deep South. Marcus possessed the same burning desire for justice that had motivated Peter's actions against Ford, but he lacked the patience and strategic thinking necessary for effective resistance. Peter recognized himself in the younger man's rage and took responsibility for channeling that energy in productive directions. Under Peter's guidance, Marcus learned the importance of careful planning and operational security that had enabled Peter's success in Georgia. The lessons went beyond practical techniques to include deeper understanding of how oppressive systems worked and where they were most vulnerable to disruption. Peter taught Marcus that sustainable resistance required building networks and institutions rather than simply striking out at individual oppressors. The relationship between Peter and Marcus developed into something resembling that between father and son, with Peter sharing not just tactical knowledge, but also the philosophical framework that had sustained him through his years of bondage and resistance. Marcus absorbed these lessons eagerly, eventually becoming one of Peter's most trusted associates in Underground Railroad operations that stretched from Canada down into the American South. Through Marcus, Peter learned of developments on plantations throughout Virginia and the Carolinas, where his story had become part of the oral tradition that sustained hope among enslaved communities. The tale of the slave who had turned hunting dogs against their master had been embellished and mythologized over the years, but its core message remained powerful and inspiring. Peter felt both pride and responsibility knowing that his actions continued to influence people he would never meet. The network of contacts that Peter established in Canada included not just escaped slaves, but also white abolitionists, sympathetic officials, and even some former slave owners who had experienced changes of heart regarding the institution they had once supported. These diverse connections provided Peter with information and resources that enhanced his effectiveness in helping others escape bondage. He learned to work with people across racial and class lines, building coalitions that were stronger than any single group could be alone. One of Peter's most valuable allies was Dr. Alexander Ross, a Canadian physician who had dedicated his life to Underground Railroad activities. Ross possessed credentials and social connections that allowed him to travel freely throughout the American South, where he gathered intelligence and established new escape routes for enslaved people seeking freedom. The doctor's scientific background complemented Peter's practical experience, creating a partnership that proved remarkably effective. Dr. Ross brought Peter disturbing news about conditions on Georgia plantations in the years following his escape. Master Whitmore had died of a heart attack in 1853, and his property had been sold to settle debts accumulated through failed cotton speculation and poor investment decisions. The new owner, a businessman named Richardson from Charleston, had implemented even harsher discipline than Ford had maintained, viewing slaves purely as economic units whose productivity needed to be maximized regardless of human cost. The information about Richardson's brutal methods motivated Peter to expand his Underground Railroad activities to include specific operations targeting Georgia plantations. Working with Dr. Ross and other allies, Peter developed plans to rescue not just individual escapees, but entire families who were facing separation through sale or transfer to other properties. These complex operations required months of preparation and coordination among multiple operators across several states. Peter's first major rescue operation focused on the family of his old friend Moses, the young man who had been savaged by Ford's dogs years earlier. Moses had never fully recovered from his injuries, both physical and psychological, but he had married and started a family despite the trauma he had endured. When Richardson announced plans to sell Moses's wife and children to cover gambling debts, Peter knew he had to act. The operation to rescue Moses's family required Peter to return to Georgia for the first time since his escape, a decision that carried enormous personal risk but felt morally necessary. Peter had changed significantly during his years in Canada, gaining confidence and skills that made him a different person than the quiet slave who had once tended fires in Whitmore's smokehouse. However, returning to the scene of his greatest triumph also meant confronting memories and emotions that he had been able to avoid during his years of exile. Peter's reconnaissance of the Richardson plantation revealed that conditions had indeed deteriorated significantly since Whitmore's death. The new owner had eliminated many of the small privileges and freedoms that had made life bearable under the previous regime, implementing a system of surveillance and punishment that made Ford's methods seem restrained to prof. By comparison, Richardson employed multiple overseers and used modern security techniques that made escape attempts far more dangerous than they had been in Peter's time. The challenge of operating in this new environment pushed Peter to develop more sophisticated methods than those that had served him during his earlier resistance activities. He could no longer rely on intimate knowledge of routines and personalities that had enabled his success against Ford. Instead, needing to adapt to changed circumstances while maintaining the operational security that had kept him alive and free for so many years. Peter's solution involved recruiting local allies who could provide current intelligence about Richardson's operations while maintaining distance from the actual rescue attempt. These contacts included free blacks in nearby towns, sympathetic white residents who opposed slavery on moral grounds, and even some of Richardson's own slaves who were willing to take calculated risks to help others escape. Building this network required weeks of careful cultivation and testing to ensure that no Confederate sympathizers had infiltrated the operation. The rescue plan that Peter ultimately developed was far more complex than anything he had attempted during his Underground Railroad work in Canada. The operation required coordinating the movements of multiple teams across several counties, timing their actions to avoid detection while ensuring that Moses's family could be extracted safely and transported to the first stage of their journey north. Every element of the plan had to account for Richardson's enhanced security measures while maintaining flexibility to adapt to unexpected developments. The night chosen for the rescue coincided with a regional gathering of plantation owners in nearby Macon, an event that would draw Richardson and several of his overseers away from the property for at least 24 hours. Peter had learned of this opportunity through Dr. Ross, who maintained contacts among the Southern elite through his legitimate medical practice. The absence of key security personnel would create a window of vulnerability that Peter intended to exploit fully. Peter's team for the operation included Marcus, who had insisted on participating despite the dangers involved, 2 other experienced Underground Railroad operators from Canada, and several local allies who would provide logistical support and misdirection. Each team member had specific responsibilities that minimized their exposure while maximizing the likelihood of mission success. Peter had learned from his earlier experiences that successful operations required both careful planning and competent execution by trusted associates. The extraction of Moses's family proceeded smoothly during the early stages, with Peter's team successfully infiltrating the plantation and locating their targets without raising alarms. Moses initially refused to believe that rescue was possible, his years of trauma having convinced him that escape attempts only led to greater suffering. Peter had to reveal his identity and share details of his successful campaign against Ford before Moses would trust the reality of the opportunity being offered. The psychological damage that Moses had sustained became apparent as Peter tried to convince him to leave with his family. Years of brutal conditioning had created a form of learned helplessness that made Moses fear any action that might attract Richardson's attention, even actions that offered genuine hope of freedom. Peter realized that rescuing Moses would require not just physical extraction, but also therapeutic intervention to help him overcome the mental barriers that slavery had created. Peter's approach to helping Moses involved sharing his own story of resistance and escape, demonstrating that even someone who had suffered severe trauma could find the courage to fight back and seek freedom. The conversation took place in whispered tones, while other team members maintained security. But Peter could see his words beginning to penetrate the defensive walls that Moses had built around his damaged psyche. Gradually, hope began to replace resignation in the younger man's eyes. The breakthrough came when Moses's wife, Sarah, added her voice to Peter's arguments, reminding her husband that their children deserved a chance at freedom, even if the adults had been too damaged by slavery to fully embrace the possibility. Her words carried weight that Peter's could not, speaking to Moses's protective instincts as a father and husband rather than his fears as a traumatized individual. Finally, Moses agreed to join the escape attempt, though his participation remained tentative and fragile. Moving Moses's family off the plantation required different techniques than Peter had used for his own escape, since the group included small children who could not be expected to maintain the discipline and silence that solo operations demanded. Peter had prepared for this challenge by developing specialized methods for family extractions, including sedatives to keep young children quiet during critical phases and modified routes that avoided areas where noise discipline was most important. The journey from Richardson's plantation to the first safe house took the rescue team through terrain that had changed significantly since Peter's original escape. New roads and settlements had altered the landscape, while increased patrols and security measures made travel more dangerous than it had been during the 1850s. Peter found himself adapting his knowledge of local geography to account for these changes while maintaining the pace necessary to stay ahead of any pursuit that might be organized. The safe house that served as the first stage of the escape route was operated by Ezra, a free black farmer who had been working with the Underground Railroad for over a decade. Ezra's property included hidden compartments and concealed routes that had been refined through years of experience, helping escapees reach freedom. Peter had worked with Ezra during previous operations, establishing the trust and communication protocols that made complex rescues possible. Moses's psychological condition became a major concern during the first days of the journey north, as the reality of what he had done began to sink in and create new anxieties about potential consequences. Peter had anticipated this reaction based on his own experiences with trauma and resistance, but dealing with it while maintaining operational security and travel schedules proved more challenging than he had expected. Moses's fears threatened to compromise the entire operation if they led to panic or irrational behavior. Peter's solution involved assigning Marcus to work specifically with Moses, drawing on the younger man's own experiences with trauma and recovery to provide peer support that Peter's leadership role made difficult to offer directly. Marcus understood the psychological challenges that Moses was facing because he had worked through similar issues during his own adaptation to freedom. The relationship between the two men became a crucial element in maintaining group cohesion during the most dangerous phases of the journey. The rescue team's route north took them through Virginia and Maryland, following established Underground Railroad paths that Peter had helped develop during his years of Canadian operations. However, traveling with a family group required modifications to standard procedures, including longer stops at safe houses and alternative transportation methods that could accommodate children and individuals with limited mobility. Every deviation from normal protocols created new risks that had to be carefully managed. The most dangerous moment of the journey came when the group encountered a patrol of slave catchers near the Maryland border, forcing them to take refuge in a swamp for nearly 24 hours while the hunters searched the area. Moses's youngest child developed a fever during this ordeal, creating a medical emergency that threatened to expose the entire group if the child's condition deteriorated further. Peter found himself making life-and-death decisions that weighed individual welfare against collective security. Dr. Ross's medical expertise proved crucial in treating the sick child, while maintaining the operational security necessary for the group's survival. The doctor had joined the rescue team for the final stages of their journey, bringing medications and equipment that enabled him to provide professional care under primitive conditions. His presence also provided additional credibility with local allies, who might be suspicious of escaped slaves, but trusted a white physician's judgment. The successful completion of Moses's family rescue established Peter's reputation as someone capable of organizing and executing the most challenging underground railroad operations. Word of his success spread through abolitionist networks, leading to requests for assistance from other families facing separation or sale. Peter found himself coordinating increasingly complex operations that pushed the boundaries of what small teams could accomplish against well-organized opposition. Peter's next major operation involved a coordinated rescue of multiple families from plantations across South Carolina, an undertaking that required months of preparation and coordination among dozens of operators working in several states. The scale of this operation exceeded anything that had been attempted previously, but Peter believed that bold action was necessary to demonstrate that the Underground Railroad could challenge slavery even in its strongholds. The South Carolina operation served as a prototype for larger resistance activities that would characterize the final years before the Civil War, as tensions between North and South reached levels that made peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. Peter found himself working not just to help individuals escape bondage, but to contribute to broader political and social changes that would ultimately end slavery entirely. His personal experiences had evolved into a larger understanding of systemic change and collective action. The success of Peter's expanded Underground Railroad activities attracted attention from both supporters and opponents of slavery, leading to increased security measures and more aggressive pursuit of resistance. Organizers. Peter adapted to these challenges by developing more sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques and building deeper networks of support that could withstand increased pressure from authorities. His operations became models for resistance activities throughout the borderlands between slave and free states. The philosophical evolution that Peter underwent during these years of expanded resistance work led him to develop new theories about the nature of oppression and the most effective methods for combating it. He began to see his early success against Ford, not just as personal revenge, but as an example of how understanding an oppressive system's internal contradictions could be used to turn that system against itself. These insights influenced his approach to larger operations and his mentoring of younger resistance organizers. Peter's theoretical understanding of resistance found practical application when he was contacted by supporters of John Brown, the radical abolitionist who was planning armed action against slavery in Virginia. Brown's representatives sought Peter's expertise in animal handling and rural operations, recognizing that his unique combination of skills and experience could contribute significantly to their planned uprising. Peter found himself weighing the potential benefits of direct military action against his preference for careful, targeted operations. The decision to support Brown's activities marked a significant escalation in Peter's resistance work, moving from Underground Railroad operations to direct military action against slavery. Peter's role in the preliminary planning for Brown's raid involved sharing intelligence about plantation security measures and animal management techniques that could be used to neutralize guard dogs and horses. His expertise proved valuable in developing tactical approaches that Brown's other supporters lacked. However, Peter's involvement in Brown's planning also exposed him to new levels of risk, as military action against slavery would inevitably provoke harsh retaliation from authorities. Peter found himself balancing his desire to support bold action against slavery with his responsibility to protect the Underground Railroad networks that depended on his leadership and expertise. The tension between these competing obligations forced him to make difficult choices about how to allocate his time and resources. The failure of Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859 created a crisis for all resistance organizers, as authorities launched sweeping investigations designed to identify and arrest anyone connected to anti-slavery activities. Peter's association with Brown's planning made him a target for federal marshals and Southern vigilantes who were determined to crush organized resistance before it could spread further. He found himself forced to suspend most of his Underground Railroad operations while focusing on personal survival. The period following Brown's capture and execution became one of the most dangerous in Peter's career as a resistance organizer, as tensions between North and South reached levels that made compromise increasingly impossible. Peter used this time to consolidate his networks and prepare for the larger conflict that he recognized was becoming inevitable. His experiences during these tense months taught him valuable lessons about operating under extreme pressure while maintaining long-term strategic perspective. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 provided new hope for anti-slavery activists, while also triggering the secession crisis that would lead to civil war. Peter found himself in the unique position of having extensive intelligence about Southern plantation operations, just as this information became valuable to Union military planners. His transition from resistance organizer to military intelligence asset represented another evolution in his long campaign against slavery. Peter's work with Union intelligence services during the early stages of the Civil War drew heavily on the networks and knowledge he had developed during his Underground Railroad years. His intimate understanding of plantation operations, rural geography, and slave community dynamics provided Union commanders with insights that proved valuable in planning military operations throughout the Confederate States. Peter had become not just a former slave seeking revenge, but a strategic asset in the broader war against slavery. The Union's evolving policies toward escaped slaves created new opportunities for Peter to expand his resistance activities beyond individual rescues to larger-scale liberation efforts. As federal forces penetrated deeper into Confederate territory, Peter found himself coordinating the evacuation of entire plantation communities whose residents sought protection behind Union lines. These operations required logistical capabilities that far exceeded anything he had developed during his Underground Railroad years. Peter's most ambitious wartime operation involved the coordinated liberation of over 200 slaves from plantations along the Savannah River, an undertaking that required cooperation between his civilian networks and advancing Union military forces. The operation served as a model for similar efforts throughout the South, demonstrating how experienced resistance organizers could leverage military campaigns to achieve liberation goals that would have been impossible through clandestine methods alone. The success of large-scale liberation operations during the Civil War validated many of the techniques and principles that Peter had developed during his years of Underground Railroad work. His emphasis on careful planning, operational security, and building trust with local communities proved essential when applied to military operations that affected thousands of people rather than small groups of escapees. Peter's influence on Union liberation strategies extended far beyond his direct participation in specific operations. As the war progressed and Union victory became increasingly likely, Peter began planning for the challenges that would face newly freed slaves during the Reconstruction period that would follow Confederate defeat. His experiences with helping escapees adapt to freedom in Canada provided valuable insights into the educational, economic, and social support systems that would be necessary to make emancipation meaningful rather than merely legal. Peter recognized that winning the war would be only the first step in a longer struggle for genuine equality. The approach of Union forces to central Georgia in 1864 created an opportunity for Peter to return to the scene of his greatest early triumph. As General Sherman's march to the sea brought federal troops within striking distance of the Whitmore plantation where Peter's resistance career had begun, Peter volunteered to serve as a guide for Union forces operating in the area. offering his intimate knowledge of local geography and plantation operations to support military objectives. Peter's return to the Whitmore plantation, after more than a decade of exile, was emotionally complex, mixing satisfaction at the Union's arrival with grief for the suffering that had continued during his absence. The plantation had changed hands multiple times since Richardson's ownership, with each successive owner implementing increasingly harsh conditions as the war made slave labor more valuable and escape more commonplace. Peter found himself confronting the limits of individual resistance when faced with the scale of systemic oppression. The liberation of Whitmore Plantation provided Peter with closure on the personal journey that had begun with his secret campaign against Ford, but it also highlighted the broader work that remained to be done in Ball. Transforming Southern society. Peter discovered that many of the people he had known during his time in bondage had died from overwork, disease, or punishment, while others had been sold away to plantations deeper in the Confederate interior where Union forces had not yet penetrated. Among the survivors Peter encountered during the plantation's liberation was an elderly woman named Grace, who had served as an informal leader among the slave community during the years following Peter's escape. Grace had kept alive the story of Peter's triumph over Ford, using it to maintain hope and inspire resistance among people facing increasingly desperate conditions. Her preservation of Peter's legacy demonstrated how individual acts of courage could influence communities across generations. The reunion between Peter and the surviving members of his old community provided an opportunity to share stories and experiences that helped everyone process the trauma of their years in bondage. Peter learned about the various forms of resistance that had continued after his departure, including work slowdowns, sabotage, and assistance to other escapees who had followed routes he had established. These activities demonstrated that his influence had continued long after his physical departure from the plantation. The end of the Civil War and the formal abolition of slavery throughout the United States marked the culmination of Peter's lifetime struggle against the institution that had defined his early years. However, Peter recognized that legal emancipation would not automatically solve the problems facing former slaves, who would need education, economic opportunities, and political rights to achieve genuine freedom. His work during the Reconstruction period would prove as challenging and important as his pre-war resistance activities. Peter's post-war career involved establishing schools and community organizations that helped former slaves develop the skills and knowledge necessary for participating in free society. His experiences in Canada had taught him about the importance of education and economic development in creating sustainable freedom, lessons that he applied to Reconstruction work throughout the South. Peter became a bridge between the resistance networks of the slavery era and the civil rights organizations that would emerge during Reconstruction. The legacy of Peter's resistance career extended far beyond his personal achievements to include the networks, techniques, and philosophical approaches that influenced generations of civil rights activists. His emphasis on careful planning, building trust across racial lines, and understanding the internal contradictions of oppressive systems became part of the intellectual foundation for future social justice movements. Peter had demonstrated that individual courage, when properly channeled and supported, could contribute to systemic change. The hunting dogs that Peter had liberated from Ford's kennel were never seen again after disappearing into the Georgia wilderness. But their symbolic importance grew over the years as the story of their liberation became part of African American folklore. The tale of the slave who turned his master's weapons against him resonated with later generations who faced different forms of civil oppression but drew inspiration from Peter's example of how intelligence and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. In his final years, Peter often reflected on the night when he had coated himself with pig's blood and crept into Ford's kennel with revolution burning in his heart. That moment had launched a career of resistance that spanned decades and contributed to the end of slavery itself, proving that even the most powerless individual could find ways to fight back against injustice when they possessed the courage to act and the wisdom to plan carefully. The overseer's dogs had been turned against him under the midnight moon, and from that act of defiance had grown a movement that changed the course of American history.